pleasure to introduce Brassier.
Basically, I should say that this is part of work in progress, and something that I've only recently started working on. And it's mainly a chapter of a book on Heidegger and Deleuze, specifically their views on temporal individuation. And unfortunately, because it's a work in progress, it's unfinished. It's an unfinished chapter as opposed to a polished paper, and you will immediately notice two glaring lacunae in the structure of the paper. I.e., one, when I talk about the third synthesis of time in Deleuze, I haven't been able to. I will quickly kind of talk about its link to death, but it's a very kind of brief and unsatisfactory discussion because I haven't had time to work it through properly. And the relationship between death, individuation, and the affirmation of recurrence in Deleuze, which is also part of the subtitle of this paper. That's also something that you will note is conspicuous by its fairly shoddy and schematic treatment. But anyway, so in his 1924 lecture, The Concept of Time, which has been called the Urform of Being and Time, Heidegger begins with the question, what is time, and shows how it gradually transforms itself into the question, who is time? Time cannot be grasped by means of the question of essence, which inquires into the what of things, das was. The traditional understanding of whatness or essence operates on the basis of a prior hypothesization of time as presence. And Usia, understood as Vorhandenheit or presence at hand, though Heidegger is not yet using these terms in 1924, predetermines the philosophical conceptualization of time. So the question, what is time, prejudges the very nature of the phenomenon about which it inquires, by reducing it to the status of a specific way of being in time, being present. But time is precisely that which is never merely present. Its way of being cannot be grasped on the basis of being present. So we cannot simply assume that time's way of being is that of intratemporal entities. And to understand how time is and how its way of being differs from that of intratemporal entities, we must first understand how we originally come to grasp the various senses of temporal being, how temporal things are. And for Heidegger, this entails grasping the intimate relation between those varieties of temporal being and our own being, as that within which temporal phenomena are encountered. So for Heidegger, the inquiry into how time is necessitates an inquiry into the way of being of that entity on whose basis we originally come to access the varieties of temporal being. And that being is, of course, our own, Dasein. Its defining characteristics, according to Heidegger, are temporal specificity, or what he calls Jaweiligkeit, and I apologize for my pronunciation, and meinness, or Jameinigkeit. Temporal specificity and meinness. But nevertheless, for Heidegger, Dasein is necessarily always mine. And this is a quote from the 24 lecture. The specificity of the I am is constitutive for Dasein. Just as primarily as it is being in the world, Dasein is therefore also my Dasein. It is in each case its own and is specific as its own. End quote. But if the temporal specificity of Dasein is in each case mine, this is to say that each of us is time, and that time as such is in each case mine. And this is indeed precisely the conclusion Heidegger draws towards the close of his lecture. And this is a quote again. The question, what is time, became the question, who is time? More closely, are we ourselves time? Or closer still, am I my time? For Heidegger, at this juncture, to ask, am I my time, is to ask, am I my Dasein? And as we know, this is to inquire into the propriety of Dasein's being as defined in terms of its ultimate and most extreme possibility, death. Dasein becomes properly individuated insofar as it appropriates death as its own. And already in this 1924 lecture, it is Dasein's appropriation of death as its own most extreme possibility what Heidegger calls its running ahead of itself towards its own past, which authentically individuates Dasein and thereby singularizes its time. The appropriation of death allows the past to be seized out of the future. In being in time, of course, this running ahead will be characterized in terms of the resolute anticipation exhibited in Dasein's being toward death. Yet, for all the significant nuances Heidegger will subsequently add in Being in Time, this intimate link between individuating death and temporal singularization remains the defining feature of Dasein's finite transcendence. So, for the early Heidegger at least, death provides Dasein's, and therefore time's, ultimate principle of individuation. And the key question in this regard would seem to be whether death and time can be said to be mine authentically or inauthentically. Yet, though the concept of time prefigures the core of Heidegger's celebrated magnum opus in charting this movement from time's what to its who, it is clearly distinguished from Being in Time by its explicit disavowal of any attempt to frame an inquiry, quote, into back beyond time into its connection with other categories. That's Heidegger's own expression. And insofar as it abjures any explicit thematization of the relation between Dasein's time and the temporal character of being in general, Heidegger will even go so far as to claim that the inquiry conducted in concept of time is not strictly philosophical in tenor. It is the attempt to articulate the relation between Sein and Dasein, and more specifically the connection between Dasein's temporal self-understanding and the temporal understanding of being in general, that distinguishes the project undertaking Being in Time from its germinal prefiguration in this 1924 lecture. So, in Being in Time, famously, the three structural moments of Dasein's being in the world constitute the originary ecstasies of temporalization. Time is nothing but the process of Dasein self-temporalizing in the threefold unity of being already, being alongside, and being towards. And in Heidegger's own words, and this is a quote from Being in Time, the phenomena of the toward, the to, the alongside make temporality visible as the ecstaticon, pure and simple. Temporality is the primordial outside of itself, in and for itself. End quote. Now, this last formulation is particularly significant because it neatly encapsulates what will turn out to be the key difficulty for fundamental ontology. Recall that the existential analytic of Dasein, outlining the ecstatico-horizontal structure of finite transcendence, was to be developed into an account of the relation between the individuated temporality, or Zeitlichkeit, of Dasein, the time which is in each case mine, and the temporality, or temporalität, of being in general. And being in general, we tentatively assume, cannot simply be coextensive with Dasein, which is in each case mine. It must harbour some pre-individual dimension. And indeed, Theodor Kiesel has pointed out that this pre-individual dimension of being had been an abiding concern of Heidegger's throughout the decade preceding Being in Time, and hence long before his so-called turn of the 1930s. And Kiesel cites as evidence Heidegger's recurrent use of the impersonal pronoun it in sentences such as "it whirls," which were an attempt to evoke the pre-theoretical and pre-worldly event of being, qua primal something, the Ur-etwas. But if Dasein's temporality is, in Heidegger's own expression, the primordial ecstaticon, in and for itself, a formulation that makes it sound remarkably like the idealist absolute, does this not imply that the only time is Dasein's time, my time? In this regard, a particularly cryptic passage from the concept of time already seems to prefigure this tendency to render ontological time entirely subservient to existential temporality.